What's up everyone, it's ENDYMION, and I know sometimes the gaming community can be very reactionary when it comes to things. But it's often because people deeply care about what makes them happy. Whether it's video games about characters they love or new adventures, people don't enjoy being talked down to. This, however, brings me to an absolutely crazy new series that somehow takes everything in gaming that players are tired of, and then just cranks them all well past the limits of sanity. Also, don't harass anybody that I talk about in this video, this is just me commenting on their stuff and dismantling it. But anyway, let's look at this crazy article from Polygon titled, "While Dungeons & Dragons reckons with its racist past, this actual play is way ahead of the curve." From the title alone, you can already feel the boiling that is virtue signaling that's erupting within. Basically, Polygon is promoting this Dungeons & Dragons campaign that has a Patreon that champions things like trans ideology. But it gets more ridiculous the more you look into it, and honestly, the more I read about it, the more it seems like this D&D campaign is probably one of the most woke things I've seen in a long time. And if you've been watching the channel regularly, you know how loaded that claim is coming for me, cause this is crazy. Anyway, this campaign thing is called Transplanar RPG. It's described on its official site as Transplanar RPG is an all-transgender, people of color-led dark fantasy TTRPG show set in an original non-colonial anti-orientalist multiverse. From this description alone, I had to take my glasses off and just put my head in my hands and just groan. Because the amount of loaded virtue signaling from the get-go is crazy. And it's basically a show designed to eradicate all semblance of white people from it and then tout itself as a safe space. By the way, anti-orientalist is a term that describes a viewpoint of the world that Asian countries are somehow inferior to Western ones. Which I find ridiculous, and I've never viewed Asian countries as lesser than Westernized ones. Oftentimes, Asian culture across the board is very family-oriented and it pushes solid qualities in its people, like chasing education, a balanced home life, and building solid foundations for the future. The only people who would unironically use terms like anti-orientalist to promote something are so lost in the sauce it's probably impossible to say them at this point. The basis of Transplanar is to create an insanely inclusive space for Dungeons & Dragons players. Like I said, it rejects white players almost entirely. The entire Transplanar operation is ran by Connie Chang, who uses various pronouns. In Polygon's own words, they explain the creator as Chang used their education in screenwriting and critical race studies to immediately dismantle most of the core concepts of Wizards of the Coast's infamous rule set. Ah yes, of course someone who studied critical race theory would be the person who comes up with ideas like anti-orientalist and non-colonialism in a game. A lot of what this Transplanar RPG stuff is based on adheres to what a designer has proposed back in 2020. This designer is named Eugene Marshall, and they argue that concepts like race should not exist, and that they are inherently racist to the overall structure of not only society, but entertainment as well. This all stems from a book they wrote called Ancestry and Culture, an Alternative to Race in 5e. I figure we hear what Eugene has to say cause, it's full of stuff to talk about. They said, and I quote, "Scientists and philosophers who study race reject the concept of race as a biological fact that discretely individuates groups of people. Race is not a biological reality, rather it is a social concept constructed and employed differently at different times in history and in different places in the world. It is not like eye color, but like citizenship, something that is based in social relations and concepts, not biology. In other words, the concept of race as it has been used from at least the Enlightenment forward to the 20th century is, frankly, bankrupt. This is not to say there is no such thing as ancestry, heritage, and genetic difference, of course. Indeed, our genetics are real, but they are a function of our individual ancestry, not our race. What folks call racial differences simply do not map cleanly onto anything in our biology as simplistic as the concept of race. What's more, that concept in the real world has been used to justify historic atrocities. Indeed, racists still use these bogus faux scientific justifications to support their prejudice. Because these harmful concepts have no place in our world, they need not be in the stories we tell with our friends either." End quote. So what I gather from what Eugene says here and what Transplanar uses as a basis is that they propose a framework that rejects the concept of race, and instead replaces that with other ideas. Eugene proposes when playing Dungeons & Dragons that things like intelligence, strength, and constitution are not based on your race, but instead your culture. And traits like height, lifespan, dark vision, or speed are based on your ancestry. So to condense what Eugene is trying to say here, basically the concept of race would become pointless, and would instead take all people from all walks of life in D&D, whether they're orc, elf, dwarf, human, or whatever, and then homogenize them. Meaning their innate strengths that are biologically tied to their origins would become obsolete. And things like their intelligence or strength would be based on their culture, which, to be real with you, makes zero sense. Your culture would not dictate your strength or constitution, as simply because you were brought up in, say, a loving family or a single-parent household or whatever other origin, it wouldn't really affect your physical strength. That would be like saying a rhino or bull's innate strengths are not based on the fact that they are without a doubt a rhino or a bull. But instead a rhino's strength is dictated by the fact it was raised in a book club or something. You can see how when you apply real-world logic and biology to what people like Eugene propose, it immediately starts to fall apart. Essentially, what Transplanar RPG and Eugene Marshall and Connie Chang are trying to propose here is that your advantages and strengths are not inherently born into you, but you develop and choose them based on your culture. Which makes little sense since, unfortunately for all of us, no matter how wishy-washy we want to think the world is, life is simply unfair. There is no reality where, based on my culture, I can suddenly become more intelligent if the biological makeup of who I am as a person doesn't come from a background of heightened intelligence. That's not to say it's impossible, but I think what these people are trying to propose is that they want to erase race and remove any uniqueness from defined frameworks. Which sounds about right considering Transplanar RPG is an all-trans D&D game. Of course they would want this because it fits their ideology. But while they're allowed to play the game however they want, it's not their right to push these concepts onto others and then claim it that it has to be this way. Even in terms of video games or literature, removing the concepts of racial traits and genetic advantages from stuff like orcs or dwarves is lame as hell. Not only does it just make everyone less unique, it proposes the ridiculous idea that every species is equal, when, whether we like to admit it or not, it's just not the case. By this same logic, a dog and a lion could achieve the same strength or intelligence if they were raised similarly. But the objective truth is, no matter what a dog does, biologically, it can never outperform a lion. There's nothing anyone can do about that because, like I said before, life is not fair. If we followed Eugene's rules, then everyone can achieve and become a famous movie star who's beautiful and loved by all. But the reality is that the amount of people who can actually achieve that are realistically only able to do so because they were born lucky and had the right genetic traits to do so. Sure, their culture has a hand in it, but there's nothing you can do to make yourself look like a Brad Pitt or Idris Elba if you don't already look that way. I get that this is all based on fantasy and technically they could just say, well, it's not real anyway, so who cares? But to me, it all just sounds like severe levels of coping in order to avoid reality. But I think removing the concept of race, especially when it comes to fantasy RPGs, is akin to killing any potential it has. Baldur's Gate 3, for example, flourishes because of its racial differences. Whether you find it offensive or not, the concept of racial inequality is ripe for storytelling in games like it. The way people treat the Horned Devil Tieflings compared to humans is there because it solidifies their place in the world. To say BG3 would be better if every race was the same down to their potential and strengths would reduce the uniqueness of all races and water them all down to just skin suits that you put on, which is not how reality works no matter how you say it. Dwarves are always going to be physically strong and resilient, and elves are more agile and long-living. It doesn't make elves a racist concept when compared to dwarves. It doesn't mean elves are problematic because their legs are longer or that they live longer than others. Instead, what it does is it makes the elven race unique and sets it apart from the other races. Removing race from the world is a juvenile and honestly weird way to look at the world, as there just simply is biological fact in the world, and no matter what we do, we can't really escape from it. I mean, as a human, am I happy knowing I probably won't live past 100 years? I mean, it kinda sucks. I would love to play all the video games that come out for years to come forever. But I'm not biologically programmed to live that long probably, and no amount of coping or rejecting that reality is going to make the truth any less real. Chang proposes how Transplanar will create a world where things like racism don't exist. They say, and I quote, "When it comes to building a world that is non-colonial, anti-orientalist, and rooted in an anti-racist understanding of fantasy, you really have to interrogate what fantasy is from the ground up. We think about people in our world and their relationship to each other and what conflict could look like without racism, which a lot of people insist can't work. In which case, I say you just have a tiny imagination. It's honestly more rewarding to build campaigns with conflicts where race is not just a natural, uninterrogated part of the conflict or even a part of the world building, but is specifically critically interrogated and said to everyone above the table, and at the table, this is not a part of our story, end quote. Then you have another person involved with Transplanar who says the content that we make is not for everyone, adds Thomas. It challenges specifically white audiences in a lot of ways, especially white cis audiences, insofar as the story really unwraps a lot of white, puritanical values of good and evil. And it's interesting to see our fans contend with that sometimes, and sometimes they can, and sometimes they can't. But you see, this is what I've been saying. You're pushing a super inclusive, diversity-driven campaign that champions things like no racism and no labels. And then you erase concepts like race for culture and you try to homogenize everything into a gray paste that can become anything. But at the same time, you also proclaim that your campaign is not for everyone and go as far as to label people as white cis audiences, when you just said your campaign rejects the concept of race and racism. So how can you be inclusive and welcoming when you objectively attack and exclude people based on race? You see how that's confusing and, dare I say, hypocritical of you? If race, gender, and things like cultural differences don't matter in your campaign, then why are you labeling people with concepts like cis, white, or saying you're all trans? Inherently, the core concept of Transplanar is based on the very things you desperately tried to convince others don't exist. You want to envision a world with no racism, no prejudice or differences. But then you promote your campaign as being defined by racial differences, prejudice against white men, and then you say it with a straight face. Look, I'm not saying Transplanar RPG can't exist. If there's an audience for it, then I wish them all the best. But you have to be crazy to not look at what they're doing and not realize that they're not adhering to the very rules they've set. They say Transplanar exists to lift up specifically trans people of color, but if race doesn't exist, you shouldn't even be using terms like trans or people of color to describe people. Otherwise, you're inherently supporting the concept that things like race exist. And when Eugene Marshall says ancestry should replace race, it's just saying the same thing. Your ancestry is your race. Whatever you are born as biologically, it stems from predisposed biological racial traits. And when you apply it to a fantasy setting, like I said before, you're just making everyone less unique in order to fit your worldview. And it's not like Transplanar is the only ones who are doing this nonsense. Recently, Insomniac Games, who made Spider-Man 2, got called out because they put the Cuban flag in Miles Morales' home. When his family isn't Cuban, they're Puerto Rican. Here's the flags side by side. Sure, they have similarities, but like, come on, how does that one get past your woke editors? Look, the point is that there are so many spaces in this big place we call the internet that are all trying to create their own communities. And I understand wanting to make something that brings people of similar thinking together. I mean, after all, my channel is full of people with common sense who champion that and free speech above all. But unlike things such as Transplanar or Polygon, I wouldn't segregate my viewers based on the color of their skin or whatever their identity is. I truly could not care less if someone who watches my stuff identifies as trans or whatever else. And I don't want to elevate anyone over anyone else for their identity or race. You want my opinion? What really dictates you as a human being is your character. We all have inherited biases or strengths based on our racial traits and upbringings. It doesn't mean we can't be respectful of one another. But to suggest we don't have inherent differences in order to appease a small minority is counterintuitive to bringing people together in the first place. And the more we segregate, label, and divide each other with things like this space is only for trans people of color, it's just not going to help anyone, and all it's going to do is create more echo chambers. But when you make something so inclusive that it ends up becoming an insane little echo chamber like Transplanar has, the results are what they are for a reason. Again, I'm not saying these spaces shouldn't exist, but when you've made everything that defines your product tied to the fabrics of race and gender, you're kind of just dismantling your own product at that point. And I understand that fantasy is just that, it's fantasy. And because of this, it can hypothetically work with whatever rules said you want it to. But this campaign is pandering to a level that honestly sounds like I'm being pranked while I'm reading about it. A fantasy world with no racism, no colonialism, and no adversity of any kind doesn't make your product unique. It just drains it of all the potential storylines it could have. It also unrealistically depicts a world where conflict can't exactly happen, and anything considered evil is simply misunderstood at best. But I think we should use fantasy and genres like RPGs to explore very hot topic issues and concepts. Because as much as I hate the term safe space, that's kind of what things like gaming or D&D tabletop allow for. You can use these mediums to teach people, but when your D&D campaign sounds more like a condescending lecture that rallies behind pandering checklists, you solidify your potential to be very niche and very, very unlikely of reaching a broader audience. Again, I'm not saying this can't exist or anything, but by God does the whole thing sound like a comedy sketch written by some Twitter user. Like, this is so far into the woke miasma that it genuinely doesn't sound real. If I told someone in real life this exists, they would probably think I'm lying to them or would just stare at me like I made up a bunch of words in order to sound smart. This is genuinely ridiculous, but at this point in society, does that even surprise us anymore? Unfortunately, not really. Good luck to Transplanar RPG and their team, but maybe work on your messaging a little. Because if you want to pretend that race doesn't exist, maybe don't exclude certain groups of people because of their race. But what do I know? I'm just a guy with common sense. Thanks for watching, subscribe, and like the video, and thanks to my patrons for their support. Remember to use my G Fuel code to support the channel, and have a great day. I'll see you in the next one.